There are some footsteps you hear with your ears, and some you feel in your bones long before any sound reaches you. And by the time Jonah turned on the narrow mountain trail that afternoon, he already knew something was behind him. Not because of a crunch in the snow or the snap of a twig, but because the silence on his back had changed its weight. He stopped where the path squeezed between two big boulders, washed smooth by years of wind and rain, breath coming in short white puffs, the straps of his backpack biting deep into his shoulders in that familiar way that said he'd been walking too long and eating too little. Above the ridge, the sky hung low and heavy, clouds pressed together in a dull gray ceiling, the kind that swallowed sound and made the world feel a little farther away. The wind threaded through the pines, carrying the smell of cold stone, sap, distant wood smoke from the valley, and something else too, thin and wild and sharp, like metal left out overnight. Jonah turned slowly, because quick movements got you bitten by things that were scared and laughed at by things that weren't. At first, he saw only the story of his own walk written in the snow behind him. His boot prints, the drag marks of his stick, the place where he'd slipped and caught himself on a knee. The trail bent out of sight a dozen yards back, swallowed by trees and shadow. Then, right at that bend, a small shape stepped out from behind a trunk and stood very still. It was roughly the size of a farm dog, maybe less, its legs too thin, and its body all angles under a winter coat that hadn't yet decided if it wanted to be thick or just stubborn. But there was nothing dog-like about the way it held itself. Its fur was a soft gray mottled with darker patches, the same color as rock faces after a storm, and its ears stood up sharp and alert. The eyes were what pinned Jonah in place, pale, almost amber, catching what little light there was and holding it, fixed on him with a focus that felt wrong for something that was supposed to be afraid of people. A wolf, he thought, though the word felt too big for how small this one was. Wolves he'd seen before, high up on the ridgeline or far across the valley, shapes moving like smoke between trees, lean and sure in their steps. They carried a kind of old, quiet confidence. This one was all tension and hesitation, like it had been running on fear for too long and had forgotten how to stop. "You're a long way from your family, little guy," Jonah said quietly, his voice flat from days, without much use. The tiny wolf's ears flicked at the sound. It stepped onto the trail, testing it, then took another step, nose up, drawing in his scent. Jonah's fingers tightened around his walking stick. Fear didn't come fast anymore. It came like everything else in him these days, slow and heavy, as if he had to decide whether it was worth the effort. He'd been chased off worse things than a skinny wolf. Men with hard eyes and harder fists at shelters, drunk voices in alleys he used to call home. Still, teeth were teeth, and hunger was hunger. Just as his grip on the stick shifted, something warm pressed against his thigh. Rust had slipped silently to his side, the mutt's patched coat bristling along the back, dark eyes fixed on the stranger, tail held halfway between uncertain and ready. Rust had been with Jonah since before the mountain, since a night behind a gas station, when both of them had been too cold and too hungry to pretend they didn't need each other. The dog knew the sounds of this ridge as well as any animal. The fact that he hadn't started barking yet told Jonah something important. This wasn't normal, but it also wasn't an attack. Jonah let his hand slide from the stick to Rust's head, fingers curling in familiar fur. The tiny wolf took 2 more steps until there were maybe 10 paces between them. Not close enough to reach, close enough to see each rib shadowed under its coat, to notice the way one front paw didn't quite touch the ground all the way before the others moved, as if some old hurt still lived in the bone. Up close, its youth was obvious, the softness of its muzzle, the fuzz along its cheeks that hadn't yet sharpened. But its eyes, those were old. Not old in years, old in knowing too much. Jonah snorted softly, more out of habit than amusement. "You're not supposed to be this close," he said. The wolf tilted its head like it was trying to understand, then huffed out a breath that fogged the air between them and stayed where it was, unblinking. Jonah turned away first. Life had taught him that nothing good came from staring contests with things that could hurt you. He adjusted the strap of his pack, dug his boots into the thin snow on the trail, and kept walking uphill. This side of the mountain wasn't for tourists or hikers with shiny gear. The path was narrow and rough, scratched into the slope by people who used to come up here to check fire lines and logging marks, and then stopped coming when budgets got cut and the forest started handling itself. The cabin he was heading to had once belonged to one of those people, a ranger called Crosby, who used to leave extra cans of food on his front porch in winters when Jonah and his mom were still in town, scraping by. Crosby died 1 year, and the cabin went quiet. The mountain took it back a bit at a time. The deed ended up in some clerk's drawer until it was worth less than the paper it was printed on. Jonah had watched the notice in the town window for 3 days before putting down his handful of crumpled bills, feeling sick with the idea that he might lose even that skinny safety net if this gamble went wrong. $5. That was what the mountain wanted for 4 leaning walls and a roof and a fireplace, whose old stone still smelled like smoke. $5 for a place that no one else wanted to climb to, especially not in early winter. Cheap, he'd told himself, temporary, safer than a bus station bench. But some part of him had whispered back, "Yours." Behind him, the faint sound of paws returned, soft as breath over gauze. He didn't look. He had the strange instinct that if he didn't turn around, the wolf would stay just where it was meant to be. Never too close. Never far enough to forget. The trail steepened. Trees thickened. Every now and then, Jonah caught glimpses of the valley far below through the branches, the thin line of the river, the toy-sized houses of the town, smoke curling from chimneys like someone had sketched warmth onto the cold air. He didn't miss it. Not the way you miss a home, anyway. The town had been another place that wasn't built. For boys like him, all elbows and bruises and wrong last names. Up here, the mountain didn't care what was written on your birth certificate. It only cared if you could stand the wind. Rust trotted ahead, then circled back, paws kicking up powder. The tiny wolf mirrored him from a distance, moving where Jonah moved, stopping when he stopped. The pattern set in so naturally that by the time the trees thinned and the cabin came into view, it felt like they'd been traveling as a crooked little pack for years. The cabin hunched in its small clearing, dark logs stacked against each other in stubborn lines, a stone chimney leaning slightly off-center as if the whole structure was bracing itself against some invisible shove. Snow clung to one side of the roof, where the sun never reached. The front steps creaked when Jonah put his weight on them, but they held. He turned at the top, chest heaving harder from the climb than he wanted to admit, and looked back down the slope. The tiny wolf stood at the edge of the clearing, chest rising fast, steam puffing from its nostrils. It had stopped just where the trees ended, paws in shadow, eyes on him. A line crossed the ground between them, invisible but real. The wild hadn't stepped over. Jonah knew better than to invite it. "You can follow me," he said, voice low, "but this part's mine." The wolf watched him, head slightly lowered. Rust stood halfway between Jonah and the tree line, tail swaying gently, ears forward, his whole body speaking a language he'd never had with any human. "It's all right. I know what it is to be alone, too." The wolf's gaze flicked to Rust, then back to Jonah. After a long moment, it circled to the side of the clearing and lay under a fir whose branches brushed the ground, giving it cover and sight lines both. A compromise. Jonah nodded once, like they'd agreed to something. Then he turned and pushed open the cabin door. It took his eyes a while to adjust to the dim. Dust floated in the air like slow snow. The place smelled of old wood, cold stone, and the faint, lingering hint of smoke from fires long gone. The furniture left behind was sparse and rough. A table, a chair with one leg badly repaired, a narrow bed frame with no mattress. The window panes were streaked but unbroken. The hearth was big and blackened. Jonah felt something in his chest unclench as he stood there, the quiet wrapping around him. "Home," he said, testing the word in a voice that wasn't quite sure it believed in such things anymore. Russ snumbled along the baseboards, tail wagging, as if he'd just been given his own house after a lifetime of doorways and alleys. Jonah shrugged off his pack, dropped it beside the hearth, and got to work. He knew better than to sit down when there was daylight left. The body got heavy fast, and on cold mountains, if you stopped too long, you sometimes never started again. He checked the roof from inside, tracing each beam with his eyes, listening for the creaks that meant trouble. He tested the walls for drafts, feeling where the wind slipped through. He found a pile of old firewood in the lean-to and split enough kindling to start a blaze, fingers going numb, even through his gloves. By the time the first flames caught, the light outside had thinned to a washed-out gray, and the cabin's interior was flickering with a soft warmth that made the place look less like a forgotten storage box and more like something that might keep 3 hearts beating through a winter. 3. Jonah straightened, the thought landing like a pebble in his stomach. He walked to the window and wiped a patch of glass clear with the side of his sleeve. The tiny wolf still lay under the fir, a small gray shape against the snow. Its eyes were open, ears angled, watching the clearing, the cabin, the sky, all at once. It wasn't resting so much as waiting. For what? He couldn't guess. For its pack. For danger. For him. The wind picked up, carrying sounds from higher up the mountain. A distant crack like ice giving way. A faint, rolling echo that might have been rockfall or just thunder trapped somewhere above the clouds. The wolf's ears twitched toward the sound, then flattened for a moment. Jonah had seen that flinch before. Not on animals, on kids in shelters when a door slammed too hard, on himself when certain names were mentioned. "What did you run from?" he asked the glass, his reflection pale and thin in it. Rust pressed his head against Jonah's hip, looking out too. The tiny wolf stayed through the night, a faint outline under the tree visible whenever Jonah glanced up from the fire. Every few hours he threw on his coat, stepped out onto the porch, and listened. The mountain at night was a different animal. The pines creaked and whispered. The snow made soft sounds as it settled. Far off, an owl called, and something small answered with a scream cut off too quickly. Each time Jonah looked toward the tree line, the wolf met his gaze, silent, steady, lending the darkness a pair of eyes that didn't feel hostile, but didn't feel safe either. Somewhere, beyond what he could see, there were other sounds, low, distant. Once, just before dawn, he thought he heard a howl high on the ridge, long and mournful, the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck consider standing up. The tiny wolf didn't respond. It only tucked its head closer to its paws and stared harder into the trees. Morning came pale and tired. Jonah opened the door with stiff fingers and stepped out into a world that had dusted itself with new snow overnight. Rust bounded ahead, happily poking his nose into every drift. The tiny wolf rose slowly from its spot, muscles stiff, snow shaking in little clouds from its coat. Its eyes found Jonah immediately. "You stayed," he said, sounding more surprised than he meant to. The wolf took one step toward him, then stopped, that invisible line still drawn between porch and forest. It lowered its head and nudged at the snow, pawing away a thin layer until dark earth showed through. Jonah frowned. The movement was too deliberate to be idle. The wolf pawed again, then looked up, then back at the ground. Jonah stepped off the porch slowly, every instinct jangling but not loud enough to stop him. He walked toward the spot, boots crunching. The wolf moved aside, making space without retreating entirely. A few inches down, the earth was different, looser, disturbed, as if something had been there recently. Jonah knelt, brushing aside the churned dirt. His fingertips met something smooth and hard. He dug a little deeper and pulled up a fragment of bone, long since picked clean, the surface worn and pale. Not unusual in itself. The forest was full of leftovers, but there were marks along this one, parallel grooves, too clean to be the work of teeth alone, like something with metal had scraped across it. Rust sniffed it, then backed away with a wrinkle in his muzzle. The tiny wolf stared at the bone, then at Jonah, then lifted its gaze to the trees, ears pricked in that rigid way that meant it heard something he didn't yet. Jonah straightened slowly, eyes following that line into the darker parts of the forest where the snow didn't quite reach. The wind shifted, bringing with it a smell he didn't know, heavy and sour and strangely electric, like the air before a lightning strike but tinged with something rotten underneath. Rust's tail lowered. The tiny wolf's fur lifted along its spine. Jonah's fingers tightened on his walking stick. "What's out there?" he murmured. But the only answer was the creak of branches and the slow sigh of the mountain. The wolf stepped closer to him than it ever had, just for an instant, shoulder brushing his leg. Then it did something that made his throat go dry. It looked up into his face, held his eyes, and then very clearly looked back toward the cabin, toward the hearth, toward the walls that, for all their gaps and drafts, were still more protection than trees and thin fur could offer, against something big enough to leave marks like that on bone. Jonah understood, not the whole story, Not yet, but enough. The tiny wolf hadn't followed him because it was curious or hungry or lonely, though it was probably all three. It had followed him because something worse was moving on the mountain, something that even wild things didn't want to face alone. And somehow, in whatever strange logic the ridge obeyed, it had decided a tired boy in a crooked cabin with a scarred mutt at his side was the safer bet. Jonah looked at the dark line of the trees, then at the bone in his hand, then at the pale eyes watching him with too much knowing. "You picked the wrong person," he said, the edge of a shaky laugh in his voice. "I'm barely holding myself together." The wolf seemed to breathe out, a small cloud in the cold air. Rust pressed closer to his knee. The mountain wind rose and fell again, brushing over them all, like a hand feeling for weak spots. Jonah closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with a weight he hadn't had yesterday. "All right," he said softly. "You can stay. Here. Close. Until we figure out what's out there." The tiny wolf blinked slowly, like a nod. It stepped back to its place under the fur, but this time when it lay down, it did so with its body angled slightly toward the cabin door, toward him, as if aligning itself with his shadow. Jonah turned and looked at the four leaning walls and the crooked chimney and the faint thread of smoke beginning to rise. He'd come up here to disappear, to be no one, to let the world forget about a boy who'd had too many promises broken and not enough kept. But the mountain, it seemed, had other ideas. Something dangerous was moving in the timber beyond his sight. A tiny wolf had staked its fragile hope on him, and whatever he discovered next, he knew it wouldn't let him stay invisible any longer. Jonah woke to a different kind of silence the next morning, the kind that feels like someone has already been watching you for a while before your eyes open. And for a long moment, he lay very still on the narrow cabin bed, listening to the soft crackle of embers in the hearth and the faint rush of wind trying to squeeze through the gaps in the window frame. Rust shifted beside him, tail thumping once before, going quiet again. Something in the dog's stillness told him the world outside wasn't the same as it had been last night. Jonah pushed himself upright, feet landing on the cold floorboards, and crossed to the window, clearing a small patch of frost with the back of his hand. The tiny wolf was exactly where he expected it to be, curled under the low-hanging fir branches near the tree line, but its eyes were open, fixed not on him this time, but on the forest. Its whole body angled toward the shadows, like it had been waiting for the woods to speak. Jonah frowned, leaning closer to the glass. There were new tracks in the clearing, faint but unmistakable, cut into the snow, sometime during the night. Not wolf, not deer, not anything he recognized. The prints were wide and uneven, as if something heavy had dragged its weight through the clearing, pacing, circling, passing disturbingly close to the cabin steps before disappearing into the trees again. Rust saw them the moment Jonah opened the door. The dog's fur bristled in a ridge down his back, a low rumble building in his chest as he stepped onto the porch. The tiny wolf rose too, ears pinned, tail stiff. Not tucked, but ready, the way a creature stands when it has learned that danger doesn't always come with enough warning. Jonah descended the steps slowly, his boots sinking into the fresh layer of snow, eyes tracking the strange prints. They spaced irregularly, some deep some shallow, like whatever made them moved on damaged limbs or shifted its weight strangely. He crouched beside one print, pressing his fingers into the edge of it. The snow there was melted slightly, as if the creature's body heat had been intense. "You smelled it last night," Jonah murmured toward the tiny wolf without turning. "Didn't you?" The wolf didn't move, didn't blink, only watched him with that eerie, unwavering focus. Jonah stood again and followed the trail a few yards toward the trees before it vanished abruptly, swallowed by the thick underbrush. The air felt wrong, heavy, as if something huge had passed through and the forest hadn't quite recovered. Rust whined softly, nudging Jonah's leg, urging him back toward the cabin. For once, Jonah didn't argue. They returned to the cabin, and Jonah shut the door behind them, sliding the old metal latch into place. Not because he believed a scrap of metal could stop something that made tracks like those, but because the sound of the latch settling gave him a momentary illusion of control. The morning wore on in a gray blur. Jonah chopped wood with a stiffness in his arms that wasn't just from cold. Rust paced near the windows, nose twitching at every whisper of wind. The tiny wolf refused food Jonah set near the edge of the clearing, not approaching, not retreating, simply existing in a taut, silent state of watching. It wasn't hunger driving it anymore. It was fear. But fear of what? Jonah found himself glancing toward the forest, again and again, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing at the back of his thoughts, like a memory he couldn't quite grasp. Around midday, he finally understood the shape of that weight. Not as danger, but as familiarity. Those tracks, those uneven, dragging prints. He had seen something like them once before, years ago, when he and his mother had followed a wounded elk along the lower trails, hoping to harvest in the meat before scavengers reached it. The elk had stumbled, dragging one hind leg behind it, leaving uneven marks just like these. But the size of the prints outside the cabin dwarfed anything an elk could leave behind. Something hurt is out there, Jonah whispered, gripping the edge of the table as the realization tightened his chest. Hurt things didn't always get weaker. Sometimes they got reckless. Sometimes they got angry. Rust stopped pacing and stared at him, as if those words meant exactly what the dog had feared. Afternoon came and went with little change, the sky never brightening, the clouds settling lower over the ridge like a lid. Snow began drifting again, slow and lazy, as though winter itself were hesitating. Jonah kept the fire alive, forcing himself to eat, to think, to plan in the small ways that kept panic from widening until it swallowed reason. Every so often, he caught the tiny wolf watching him through the window, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Not pleading, not asking, just studying him the way he'd studied the creature's tracks. By evening, Jonah couldn't sit still anymore. He stepped onto the porch, Rust at his side, breath forming pale clouds as the wind picked up. The tiny wolf rose from its place under the fir, trotting a few steps toward him, before stopping exactly where it always stopped, as though obeying an invisible rule neither of them had made, but both understood. "I know you want me to do something," Jonah said softly, hands tucked beneath his arms for warmth. "But I don't even know what's out there." The tiny wolf flicked an ear, then glanced toward the forest, its nose lifting into the wind. Jonah followed the look. The trees swayed in slow motion, their branches shivering under the rising wind. Darkness pooled between the trunks, thickening. Then, somewhere deep inside the woods, a sound rose, a low groan, long and hollow, like a boulder being dragged across ice, but laced with something alive underneath. Rust stiffened, ears flattening. The tiny wolf took a step back, lowering its head. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. It didn't sound like any animal he knew. It didn't sound like something that belonged to these woods. The groan faded, but the echo lingered, stretching across the clearing like a warning. Jonah felt it vibrate in his ribs. The wolf turned back to him, eyes impossibly sharp in the fading light, and for the first time since he'd met it, it approached. 2 cautious steps, then 3, closing half the distance between them. It stopped just shy of the porch, paws barely visible in the rising snow. That invisible line was broken now. The tiny wolf made a sound then, a soft, breathy whine, not loud, not panicked, but filled with something that felt startlingly like trust or desperation. Jonah crouched on the porch, his heart pounding in slow, heavy beats, watching the wolf's sides rise and fall. "You want me to help," he whispered. "But I can't help if I don't know what you're facing." The wolf blinked slowly, then turned and looked again toward the dark woods. Jonah followed the line of its gaze, and this time he saw it. Not movement, not shape, just a reflection. 2 faint glints deep between the trees, too high to belong to anything that walked on 4 legs naturally, spaced too far apart to be comfort. Eyes, watching. Jonah's breath hitched, and he reached for Rust instinctively. Rust growled, low and steady, hackles lifting like sharp grass in the wind. The eyes blinked once, a small shift of light, then vanished as if whatever owned them had simply stepped backward into a deeper layer of shadow. The forest went still again. The tiny wolf whined once more, and then did something Jonah hadn't expected. It lowered its body onto its front legs, head dipping in a gesture so clear it silenced the wind in Jonah's ears for a heartbeat. Submission. To him. Asking for leadership. Asking for a decision. Jonah stared at the tiny wolf, at Rust, at the place where those eyes had disappeared, feeling a slow, heavy resolve tighten around him like the mountain's cold. He had spent most of his life being the smallest thing in every room, the one pushed aside, overlooked, underestimated. But here, on this ridge, with a wolf pup and a dog looking to him for answers, he felt something shift. Maybe the mountain had chosen him long before he ever chose it. Maybe the creature in the woods had been waiting too. "All right," Jonah said finally, voice steady in a way that surprised him. "We're not running. Not tonight." The tiny wolf rose slowly, snow shaking from its fur. Rust pressed close to Jonah's leg, ready. Jonah stepped off the porch, crunching into the snow, and the tiny wolf moved beside him, not following, not trailing, but walking alongside him at a cautious distance, matching his pace. Not a stray, not a guest, a companion. Together they approached the edge of the clearing, the trees looming like dark ribs around a beating heart. The forest exhaled a cold breath over them. Jonah stepped forward anyway. Whatever waited in those shadows, the creature with the dragging gait, the glowing eyes, the ancient hollow groan, it had scared a wolf into seeking a human. It had circled his cabin in the night. It had marked the snow with prints that looked like warnings, carved into the earth itself. Jonah tightened his grip on his walking stick, feeling Rust's warmth at his side and the tiny wolf's thin shadow beside them. If the mountain wanted him to face whatever was out there, it would not find him alone. He inhaled once, slow and steady, tasting the cold metal edge of the wind. And then, with the last light of evening fading behind him, Jonah stepped into the trees